Welcome back. Well, over 1 trillion liters of oil sands wastewater in northern Alberta has drawn the attention of the United Nations as that area continues to slowly dry up. Oil sands mining companies keep insisting that the release of the water that is used in stores at oil sands mines. For more on that story, we're joined by Rodney Guest. He's Director of Water and Closure at Suncor Energy. Welcome, Rodney. First question, what exactly is in this wastewater?
Great question, Tara. A lot of people don't totally understand the process that we use, but essentially the water that we start with to do the extraction process of oil sands bitumen actually comes from the river. So a lot of the base chemistry and things that are in there, it actually starts with the river itself. But then we basically take that water and we heat it up and then we mix it with the ore. And so in the process of mixing the water with the ore, the bitumen floats to the surface, and then basically we get those tailing streams that come off the bottoms. And so in the tailings water, we have a mixture of basically water, sand, some clays, and a little bit of residual bitumen that is in there as well. And that's what goes out into those tailings ponds. And from there, basically, the fine clays and the sands, they settle out, and we end up with that tailings water that sits on the top. And then we take that water and we recycle it back into the process and use it again.
I guess the question here is, why is it so essential that it be released? What's in that process?
Yeah, so basically, it's a great question. We're basically looking at over the life of a mine is eventually we're going to start wanting to close and reclaim these mines and progressively reclaim them. And so what we've been doing since we started operating back in the late 50s, early 60s, there is that we've been actually holding on to all the water on our site, and we constantly recycle that water. But as we start going through the mining sequence and we get closer to the end of mine life, well, we're actually starting to reclaim these sites. And so the tailings ponds that we have, we're actually looking to close them. And as we close them, we basically have to do something with the water. And one of the primary things that we're ultimately going to have to do is we're going to have to release this water back off-site so that we can actually close and reclaim the mine sites. And so for the oldest mines, like Suncor or the Syncrude mine as well, is that we're actually starting to approach those timelines where we're starting to reduce the amount of storage capacity that we have for water on our site in order to enable that reclamation and closure. And so that's where we get into this conversation about needing to treat and release this water back to the environment where we took it from originally.
What do you think are some of the biggest obstacles when it comes to releasing this wastewater? Is it the communities? Is it lack of knowledge generally, or what are you up against?
Well, there's a number of things to start with. So number one, we actually don't have provision or a set of federal effluent regulations right now for the industry. So number one, the rules and the guidelines for setting what those criteria are to enable us to be release water, that's part of a process that's ongoing with the provincial and the federal governments in order to determine what those criteria are. The second part is that, yeah, there is a lot of questions for people around what's in the water and understanding like how can you treat it. So we do see a lot of concerns, from communities and from stakeholders asking very basic questions about, well, what's in the water and can you treat it and can you put this back and do it safely to protect the environment. There's been lots of discussion about frankly, misinformation about the level of difficulty around being able to treat this water and release it back to the environment. And I think that's something that we do face as a challenge, is like, how do we have that conversation to get everybody to understand and be able to make progress forward on an issue that ultimately is going to help reclaim and close these sites and return it back to being a boreal forest.
What else needs to be done to this water to make it even safer? Is there anything else we can do?
So again, really good question. One of the things that we see around treatment is people ask a lot of questions like, can you treat this water? And so most people probably don't actually understand what goes into how to treat water. Lots of people, they live in a city, they turn on their taps, water comes out, they flush their toilets and the water goes away. But essentially, there's a global industry that has been looking at like, how do we treat water for drinking water purposes? How do we actually treat wastewater for releasing it safely back to the environment? And so that's where industry has played a lot, where we have a lot of ready to go technologies that can be applied to this wastewater. Obviously, the first thing we need to know is really essentially what will be those criteria to enable us to know what the targets is that we're going to reach. But but we expect a lot of those targets to be very similar to what other industries actually have to do in order to treat and release their water. So once we have those criteria, we'll go through a process where we'll basically build treatment processes and put them together in order to achieve those effluent criteria in order to make it safe. And that's really the discussion that has to happen, between the province and the federal government. They're talking about those criteria, but they're heavily engaged with the stakeholders in the Indigenous communities in the region, because they're the ones who have the questions like, how do we know that the water is going to be safe? And so that's what will be part of that overall process. And the governments have a lot of experience in doing this.
When we think about the oil sands industry, there tends to be a lot of concern generally about everything. But, this sector isn't the only one that releases wastewater. What are some of the other sectors, and is that considered a safe practice in some of the other areas and industries?
Yeah, this is a common thing a lot of people don't understand. We're actually the only sector that actually doesn't have the ability to treat and release our wastewater. All other sectors that we know of in Canada, the United States, and globally have the ability to treat and release wastewater. And this is where, we as an industry, as a sector, where we have this grounded confidence in the ability for us to actually treat and release this water, is because it is a global practice. It's a global best practice in terms of borrowing water from the environment, but ultimately knowing that we do have care and control of that water while it's on our sites, but then eventually we have to release it back. And when we release it back, it needs to be safe for the environment, but also all other downstream users. And so that's that grounded confidence that we look at from where we see this done with the other sectors.
And one thing I want to end on, Rodney, when we think about the oil sands, many of us think about those tailings pond, that solid material. That's not what we're talking about here. What happens to those materials?
Yeah, that's a really, really key point, is that, we are talking about water. It is industrial wastewater that we're going to treat, and we're going to release that back. The solids, the sand and the clays, all of those actually stay behind. They're going to stay within the tailings ponds. Most of the mine sites, when we close them, those ponds will actually be closed and turned into terrestrial landscape. So they'll become, some sort of rolling landscape, spotted with wetlands, or in some cases, with some small lakes on them as well. But it's going to be largely terrestrial. So you're going to see lots of forests and lots of landscape, coming back to the environment, and that's what it's going to look like when we're done.